We wanted to know which wearable can best track your sleep stages. So together with the University of Salzburg, we ran one of the biggest wearable sleep studies ever, and the results are pretty amazing. We can now see which devices are best at tracking your deep sleep, light sleep, REM sleep, and awake time. I just finished my initial analysis, and there are some discoveries in there that I've never shared before. But as always, there's a lot of nuance as well. So let's dive right in with this overview plot right here, where the best devices are towards the top right. And this already shows you quite a clear overview. By the way, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now I'll explain the setup of the study in a second, but I wanted to make sure to share the most important results right up front. What you see here are probably the metrics that most manufacturers are optimizing for. So along the horizontal axis we have something called Cohen's kappa, and along the vertical axis we have the average sensitivity, so the average agreement with the individual sleep stages. So again, that means the better the agreement with the reference, the more to the top right a device is. Now we have some clear winners and clear losers here, I would say, and you will see a few devices in here that you might have heard of, like for instance the Oura Ring, the Apple Watch, Fitbit, Whoop, and also Garmin. I think these are probably the most important results. There's also Sleep 2 right here, but this is from the people at the University of Salzburg. So I would always take those results with a grain of salt because they of course have a vested interest in making that look better. There's also this Circle Plus ring that I hadn't really heard of, but the University of Salzburg wanted to include it. And finally, these are some checks that I included. So one where we only have light sleep for all the stages, sort of an average night of sleep that I calculated from an independent data set, and also the median polysomnography, so reference night. But all of these do worse than the devices themselves, so that's already a good start. But let's start by focusing at the devices that everybody knows of. What is pretty clear here, I would say, is that the Apple Watch, the Oura Ring, and the latest algorithm of the Whoop strap are performing best. So these are the top performers. Below that we have the old algorithm of Fitbit, so unfortunately we weren't able to test the new algorithm, and the old algorithm of the Whoop strap. And finally, Garmin and the Circle Plus ring do worst if we go by these metrics. Now, by now, anybody using the Whoop strap will be relying on this new algorithm right here. So the old algorithm is less relevant, but those are the results from before the summer of 2025. So looking at your results from that period, you'll be using the old algorithm, and after the summer of 2025, you've been using the new algorithm. So all of these are doing pretty well, but there's a lot of data missing here. So these are sort of the high-level overview results. Again, I should note that the Sleep 2 algorithm by far did best. This is an app developed by the University of Salzburg, but of course, again, they have some vested interest in making this look better. I don't think they did anything to make it look better, but I just want to be upfront about that. Now, these are the two metrics used a lot in sleep science, so the Cohen's kappa and the average sensitivity, and I think these are probably also what the different manufacturers are optimizing for. And it seems as though Apple, Oura, and Whoop are doing a bit better at optimizing than, for instance, Garmin. Now, Fitbit actually has a newer algorithm that is supposed to be better, so it could actually be that they are moving more towards this area right here as well, where we have Apple, Oura, and Whoop. But we cannot say for sure. In my early testing, it does appear to be improvement over the old algorithm, so that could mean that Fitbit is also one of the top performers. But these two metrics that we're looking at here, so Cohen's kappa and average sensitivity, don't tell the full story by far, because there are many more things to look at that will bring a lot of nuance to these results, and then the results aren't quite as clear as you can see here. I do have one more important thing to remind you of, and that is that all these results here are my initial analysis. However, these are not yet the final results, and they could change if I find, for instance, some bugs in my code. I haven't found any yet, but still it's important to check them later, and if there's any change, I'll of course let you know. Now, before looking at a lot more results that will bring a lot of detail to these plots, let me first explain how the study was actually set up. And this figure right here from the manuscripts actually shows you that quite clearly. So we had 20 participants with about 2 dropouts. So let's say we had 18 people left in the study that were tracked over a total of 5 days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And each of these nights had a different focus. The first night was to get them used to the reference device, which is polysomnography. So they had a normal night of sleep at home. They could go home with the device, and they actually wore a lot of different devices. You can see that right here. So they had 3 devices on the left arm, 3 devices on the right arm, and these were the exact same devices. So they wore 2 Garmins, 2 Fitbits, 2 Oura Rings, etc. They also had a Whoop strap actually on their biceps together with a Polar Verity Sense and a Polar H10. The Verity Sense and the H10 are used for the Sleep 2 algorithm. So they slept with all these devices all the 5 nights, where the first night was getting them used to the polysomnography, so the reference device, because you need to get used to sleeping with all these electrodes on your head. The second night was a normal night of sleep. Again, they could always go home with the sensors on. Then on the Wednesday, we had a sleep restriction where they both had to sleep shorter and they were forced to be awake at about 3 a.m. in the morning, I believe, for about 10 to 20 minutes. They had to do 2 10-minute slots. Then on Thursday, they were allowed to sleep normally again and they had to recover from the Wednesday. So that's why on the vertical axis here, the total time asleep was a lot higher on Thursday than on Wednesday. And then on Friday, they had to sleep longer than normal. So that was the setup because we wanted to have different nights of sleep in the study, not just a good night of sleep, but also bad nights of sleep. Now, before we looked at how these devices performed overall in terms of their sleep stages, however, there are a few more important metrics. And the first is to see if these devices predict the correct amount of each of the sleep stages. So can they predict what percentage of your night was light sleep, deep sleep, etc. And that is shown in this plot right here. So we have always 2 Apple Watches, 2 Circle Rings, 2 Fitbits, because there's one on the left and one on the right arm. And in this plot, you can see the difference between what the device predicted was the percentage of each of the sleep stages and the reference. So device minus the reference. And you can see that almost all devices predicted too little awake time, except for the Oura Ring. That's the pink one right here, and that was still roughly in the range. But especially the Whoop strap predicted too little awake time. If we go to light sleep, there the Whoop strap, also the Sleep 2 algorithm, and here the Oura Ring are roughly in the good range. The other devices predicted too much of light sleep. Now the third category right here is deep sleep. And here again we see that Sleep 2, Oura, also Garmin, also Fitbit, the Circle Ring, those were roughly in the correct range. But the Apple Watch, for instance, actually predicted too little deep sleep. And this is something we've seen before. Now, Apple has also updated their algorithm since the testing, so it might be a bit better. And the Apple Watch actually also predicted too much light sleep. Also, the Whoop strap tends to detect a little bit too much deep sleep. And then finally, right here again, we're looking at REM sleep. And for REM sleep, the devices that are more or less in the correct rough range are the Whoop strap, the Sleep 2 algorithm, the Oura Ring, Fitbit, Circle, and we can actually see here that Garmin, so the red one, predicts too little REM sleep, and the Apple Watch predicts a bit too much REM sleep. So these are the percentages. So in summary, basically all of them predict too little awake time except for Oura and Sleep 2. And we can see, for instance, that the Apple has too little deep sleep, but Garmin has too little REM sleep. So the percentages tend to vary a bit. The best performers for the percentages in this case, I would say, are Oura and Sleep 2. Now this is super interesting, but what we are missing here is one important thing, and that is the day-to-day variation. Or in other words, if you have more deep sleep, does the device also detect more deep sleep? Overall, I generally don't care if a device doesn't detect enough deep sleep, as long as it knows correct for you which nights you had more deep sleep and less deep sleep. Even if overall it's off by 20%, if it always knows which nights have more and less, I think that's much more important. But before looking at those results, running this channel next to my full-time job as a scientist is neither easy or cheap. So I want to ask for your support, and there are several ways of doing that. First of all, if you use one of my affiliate links down in the description below, be it for the Whoop strap, the Oura Ring, or the H-Sleep pod, you get the best discount possible and you support the channel at the same time. There's also my general Amazon affiliate link, and if you make that your default way of going to Amazon, for instance by bookmarking it, you support the channel each time you buy something from Amazon. And finally, for direct support, you can become a YouTube member, which is basically like Patreon on YouTube and gives you early access to some of my videos. Hi, Rob from the future here. I actually did a bunch of extra analyses because I also presented this work at my workplace, and there are some super interesting results in there. One question I actually asked myself is, what data do I use from day to day and you might use from day to day, and how well can the different devices measure this? And one thing I look at is, did I get more deep sleep and REM sleep, for instance, than normal, or less of those than normal? So I wanted to know, can these devices measure this? I'll show you an overview in a second, but first I'll show you one example for the Oura Ring right here, where for each person I normalized over the 5 nights their average amount of each of the sleep stages and subtracted that from each of the individual nights. Basically what we're looking at is, can a device see when an individual person gets more or less of each of the stages? So here along the vertical axis we have the Oura Ring in this case, and on the horizontal axis we have the polysomnography, so the reference. And luckily we can see there is generally an agreement, though there is still quite some noise in there. And here we have something similar, but now for REM sleep, and this agreement is even better. Here you can see very good agreement in the amount of REM sleep as measured by the reference and as measured by the Oura Ring. But of course we can also plot this for all devices together by looking at something called a correlation. So basically, how good is that agreement between the stages? So we have the different devices here along the horizontal axis, and we had 2 of them on each individual, and the sleep stages here along the vertical axis. Now first, again, Sleep 2 does by far the best. I do think there is a technical bias here that makes Sleep 2 perform a bit better than other devices because it was tested in the same lab as where it was developed. But still, I think it is one of the best performers out there. But out of the more commonly used devices, the Oura Ring generally does really well, except for when we're looking at awake time. There the correlations are quite low. It does especially good for REM sleep and light sleep, and decently for deep sleep. If we look at the Whoop Strap, the new algorithm, we see this does really well for REM sleep and also really well for light sleep. Deep sleep is pretty okay. Awake time is where it really struggles. Interestingly, the Apple Watch does a lot better for awake time, also does decently for light sleep and REM sleep, but not so good for deep sleep. So again, here we see that problem that the Apple Watch has with deep sleep detection. And I would say all these algorithms and devices have their strength, and based on this, these would be some of my top recommendations. And I have to say, Garmin and Fitbit are doing worst out of all of them. The REM sleep agreement of Fitbit is still pretty good, and the light sleep agreement of Garmin isn't that bad, but still I would say compared to the other devices, they're really just doing one level lower for sure. Now Fitbit has gotten an update recently, so it might be performing better. And one thing I do have to mention, in this study we really didn't include any super bad devices, so some devices that did really badly in my testing. Even Garmin is sort of in the middle of all devices. I've never tested the Circle Plus ring, so I cannot say much about that. But I do expect there are even worse devices out there than Garmin, for instance. Finally, I did want to mention that there's a lot of individual variation here. So a device won't do equally well on all people. And that's displayed in this plot right here. Now in this case, we're looking at the average sensitivity along the horizontal axis and the worst sleep stage sensitivity along the vertical. That's because that's closer to the plots I normally make, and also because we can see a bit clearer some spread between the devices. Again, Sleep 2 with Polar is marked in orange right here. We have Oura right here in pink, Whoop with the old and the new algorithm in blue, in cyan the Apple Watch, Garmin is red, Fitbit is green, and the circle ring here is in black. And each dot now here is a single individual. And there we can clearly see that some people got better results than others, so your individual mileage might vary. So for some people the Oura Ring did amazing, whereas for others it wasn't quite as good. Actually for Whoop the spread appears to be quite small, and the same for the Apple Watch. There isn't quite as big a spread as for instance for the Oura Ring. And Garmin and Fitbit both don't do great, and there's also still quite a spread here. So be aware that individual mileage might vary as well. Rob from the future here. So there's one other way we can also look at the individual variation, and that is by ranking for each individual person which device performed best and which performed worst. So we rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then we just count how often is each device at number 1, number 2, number 3. And that's plotted right here. So again, the different brands are colored, and we can see Sleep 2 always does best. I do think there's some technical bias making them look a little bit better than they are actually. So this is because they are tested in the same lab as where they were developed. But if we look at the remaining devices, I think the patterns are really interesting. First of all, we can see that after sleep 2, that is, for most people, the Oura Ring ranked at position 2 or 3. So it's really one of the best devices out there of the remainder. Apple is actually quite interesting because it splits people into 2 groups. There's a bunch of people for which it is at rank 2 or rank 3. But also a bunch of people where it's at a lower rank, so rank 5 or 6 right here. Now Whoop is much more stable, so it's usually somewhere in the middle, so usually around rank 4. Yes, there are some people for which it is worse, but overall it appears to be a bit more stable. Then following those devices, we have the next best, which is Fitbit, so it does reasonably well, mostly being split between rank 4 and rank 5. And then Garmin is really the worst out of the remaining popular devices. And yes, the Circle Plus ring is really the worst by far. So I think this is actually a very comprehensive way of looking at the ranking, but also looking at individual variation, where really only the Apple Watch splits people up into 2 groups. Otherwise, the results are quite stable. Now to close off, I wanted to show that similar overview plot, but now again back to the individual devices, because this right here is similar to how I normally show my testing on myself, with the average sensitivity over the 4 stages weighted equally along the horizontal axis and the worst out of the stages along the vertical axis. Now here I actually only included the healthy individuals, so there were 2 people with some sleep issues. Again, the question is how much of a difference that made. It actually made very little difference in this case. But here we can see, first of all, a small improvement of the old algorithm of Whoop to the new algorithm. But in this case, we can see that the Oura Ring stands out because it was good over all the sleep stages. It was very consistent over all of them, and that's why it really stands out right here. So it doesn't have a single bad stage, and the worst sensitivity across all sleep stages is over 65% or so, so looking really good. Whereas all the others struggle with either deep sleep or awake time, so they're a lot lower along this axis. Still, it's pretty clear that after the Oura Ring, the best devices out there are the new algorithm of the Whoop strap, the Apple Watch, then the old algorithm of Fitbit, and finally Garmin, with Circle being a bit weird. So it's the lowest right here along the horizontal axis, which is in my opinion the most important axis, but it's actually not that far off from some of the other devices like Garmin and Fitbit, for instance. Still pretty similar result to what we saw before, just different metrics. And again, going back to the initial result we started with, overall, I would still say the best devices out there currently are Apple, Whoop and Oura, and probably Fitbit / Google now with their updated algorithm. Unfortunately, we couldn't restage the data we already had, so we cannot test it. With Whoop, we were able to do that. And Garmin just isn't quite as good. It isn't terrible. There are definitely worse devices out there. We didn't include them in the study because I already suspected they weren't that great. And these black knights right here are sort of virtual fake data that I added to see this is the minimum a device should be doing, and probably better than this in order for it to be tracking anything at all. And luckily all devices were at least getting some signal there. But one thing you might not have noticed is that this plot looks slightly different from the initial plot. And that is because I only based this right here on a normal night of sleep. So this second day where they had a normal night of sleep. And what I wanted to actually see is, if we actually give them a bad night of sleep, do we see differences in performance? And those results are right here. So this is for the 3rd night where they had an interrupted night of sleep. So they had to wake up at 3 a.m. and they were also restricted in the amount of sleep that they could get. And overall, the results actually don't change much, except for Garmin and Fitbit changing positions. So the old Fitbit algorithm appears to be more sensitive to a bad night of sleep. But generally the order is still the same, so Oura, Apple and the new Whoop strap algorithm are still doing best, and Sleep 2 is outperforming everyone. We also saw that in this night right here. I'm highlighting Sleep 2 a little bit less for 2 reasons. 1, it's used a little bit less, and 2, this is an algorithm developed by the people who ran the study. Again, I do think they were honest in showing their results, but it is a conflict of interest. So I'm actually really happy to see that it appears that performance didn't really degrade if you have a bad night of sleep. But one thing I would want to test that we cannot really test here is if you have people with severe sleep issues, if their performance goes down a lot, because that's what I've seen in other studies. But that's just something we didn't test right here, because the non-healthy people in the study, which were 2 or 3 people, depending how you define it, didn't really have major sleep issues. Now again, these are the initial results of the study as I analyzed them myself. There's also a preprint out by the person who led the study, and you can find that link down below. Now I'll make a more complete video in the next few months where I go into more detail about the sleep study and also reanalyze so it looks even a bit better. If you want to see that video, don't forget to subscribe. However, I was already so excited about these results that I already wanted to get them out there to you for you to see and to hopefully help you make your purchase decisions. Now, many thanks to the people at the University of Salzburg who did most of the hard work in this study, especially Pavlos who led the study and Lauren. So give them some love in the comments below. Now, if you do decide to get yourself a Whoop strap, an Oura ring, an 8 sleep pod, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper or coffee beans, you want the best discount possible and you also want to support the channel, use one of my affiliate links down below. Now, I think you will like this video right here on the Amazfit Helio strap, or this video right here on my favorite sleep improvement device, the 8 sleep pod.